All right, we are now live. How about that? Welcome. We are glad to have you here with us. This is a Thursday evening edition of what could be an interesting next couple of days over basically the eastern half of the U.S. with the remnants of the Hurricane Harvey coming up through the Ohio Valley. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Just wanted to introduce everybody. Actually, of course, if you haven't watched these before, I'm Chris White, located in Roanoke. I'm a storm chaser, former Hokie alumni storm chaser, and also I chase for WDBJ7 here in Roanoke. Andrew Smith, you can wave there, Andrew. He is also a former Hokie, an alumni storm chaser, and he chases for the CBS 6 station in Richmond there. And our special guest panelist we have is John Boyer. You wave, John. There you go. Who is the meteorologist on staff at the Richmond Times-Dispatch, who's going to join us tonight and provide some of his expertise and background. So to start things off here in terms of the overall discussion, let me do a screen share and come here and see what we can look at for the overall situation. And we'll pull this up here. Oh, see that now?
Yep. Yes.
Okay. I need to get over here. So this is the Weather Prediction Center's graphics. It's for the surface fronts and locations. And actually, I have it on 8 o'clock Friday, or 8 o'clock Thursday, or 0Z Friday, which is right now, basically. And here we have over the mid-south, we have the remnants of Hurricane Harvey. And you can see all the rain and predicted, and there's the red for the severe storms to the northeast of it. And that's going to track up to the northeast as we go in ahead in time. But the other major factor in the next couple of days for us here in Virginia will be this front that's dropping south. As I move this forward, here is 06C, it's 2 a.m. Friday, 8 p.m., or I'm sorry, 8 a.m. Friday morning. And here's Friday afternoon. You can see by this time the front has pushed south into North Carolina. And then the circulation, the remnants of Harvey are starting to merge with it. And of course, you can see the broad precipitation shield here. So the main effect that we're going to see here in Virginia tomorrow is cool air. You can see this high start wedging some cool air down the eastern side of the mountains. And also, of course, plenty of rain as this moisture that Harvey's picking up from the Gulf and surging northward over top of the cool wedge. So we're going to have a fair amount of rain over the next 24 hours or so. But if I push this forward, here's 8 p.m. Tomorrow night. Here's 8 a.m. Saturday. And here's the interesting part. Now you have the circulation center basically over the Kentucky-Ohio border here. And you have this warm front extending basically along the North Carolina-Virginia border. And a couple of the models, we'll talk about it here as we go. A couple of the models, notably the GFS and the NAM, push this warm front northward, basically pivoting about this point, roughly Clarksville, South Boston area, and pivots it north, sending some higher dew points and instability further north for Saturday afternoon. So Saturday evening, it kind of looks like this, with the warm front pushed north and a cold front pushing back to the east. So that could provide some interesting activity, if you will, along especially the Interstate 85-95 corridors on Saturday afternoon. So that's a real quick look at things. Let me come back out of the screen, and I'll toss it over to Andrew to chat a little bit more about some of the details.
Yeah, Chris, I've been looking at the 3K NAM, my kind of go-to model around here. I think it's not the best model this summer. I've been having issues with it, but it's not as bullish as the WPC is in terms of any activity firing off that warm front. It definitely shows the warm front kind of creeping up, but I think it shows, I think the WPC had a bit of a trough kind of hanging off that front in front of the pseudo cold front coming in behind Harvey. That seems to be pushed further east in the 3K NAM, but it's picking up almost the 95 corridor and kind of sitting there most of the day, slowly pushing east. And just looking at the 3K NAM's projected reflectivity, it really does not fire anything at all on Saturday. It actually kind of blew me away how little it has. It pretty much just fires one cell across the bay and onto the eastern shore. But a lot of the parameters are there. There's some decent cape coming into the southeastern Virginia. decent shear, especially with that warm front sitting right there. It's definitely picking up on that interaction between the wedge coming in from the north and the warm air coming in from the south. Between the 2 days here in Virginia, Saturday's the closest option. Friday, as you said, is just going to be a cold air damming event, kind of unusual. It's going to be like a springtime setup around here, what normally is a successful chasing day for you. But looking at it, looking Friday too, it's more, the focus is going to be more in North Carolina. There's some impressive parameters then with that interaction between the warm front and cold front appears to be a lot stronger on Friday further south than it's going to be in Virginia on Saturday. So I'm going to kind of look around a few of the other models here while we're going on with our discussion to see if other models are handling Saturday a little different. Because if I go based on the 3K NAM right now, I'm going to be sitting at home all day Saturday watching. If anything fires, it's going to be firing over the bay and heading east and leaving Richmond in a kind of a soupy environment, but for some reason not enough to kick off any severe weather.
Okay, that's a good analysis there. Not really sure how, I'm not that familiar with how good the 3K NAM has been working on with the wedge and the cold air damming events, but maybe we'll toss it over to John Boyer and see if he has some background he can provide for us. What do you think, John?
Well, I think we kind of look at history, both the long history and the short-term history, as far as how prolific Harvey has already been when it comes to tornadoes. And we're not talking about direct impacts from Harvey. Things, when they come this far inland, are not black and white. They're kind of grayscale. I think of it as a tropical influenced tornado potential, not the way you get them in that quadrant right at landfall. But I just looked this up. The number of tornado warnings issued by National Weather Service in Houston while they were dealing with that multi-day event was 157 tornado warnings in reference to Harvey. And when you throw in Lake Charles office and all the others in the Mid-South that experienced activity today, through Memphis, Jackson, you're talking 306 tornado warnings, either directly or I think indirectly associated with Harvey's circulation.
Wow.
I don't know if that's a record. That would be hard to look up at this point, but at least 40 reports in the Storm Prediction Center along the Gulf Coast since August 25th. So, you have, just not even looking at that, tomorrow's ingredients in North Carolina look very troublesome for at least having several rotating storms in that region, maybe across the Appalachians too. Climatologically, when you look at other storms, or rather other tropical storm and hurricane remnants that have created tornadoes in North Carolina, this is something I happened to do a lot of research about last summer. I wrote a piece for WRAL.com on the very topic of tropical storms or hurricanes creating tornadoes in North Carolina proper. Get this, 1 in every 6 tornadoes on record in North Carolina had a tropical fingerprint, whether it was from one that made landfall right on that coast, or a storm such as Harvey that makes landfall on the Gulf Coast and works its way up into the Tennessee Valley. That having a center somewhere in central Tennessee is kind of a climatological sweet spot for the bands flowing north on the right side of the circulation to have enough helicity, enough spin there in central North Carolina, especially central and western North Carolina. That's a trouble spot when your remnant center is near Nashville or Bowling Green. This would be kind of on the western envelope climatologically of what's produced tornadoes in North Carolina in the past, 1 to 2 days after landfall, but it has that look. So it'll be interesting to see when everything is counted up. It may take longer than normal, I think, because flooding has been the far greater, more immediate threat to life and property in Texas and Louisiana. So there may be reports or damage that we'll find out in the days or weeks to come that are associated with Harvey.
Okay, well, sure. That's a good summation of some data that we didn't have, and I appreciate it. Mm-hmm. Just along those lines, and this is one of the things that had my juices flowing, again, because of the powerful circulation around it and us being on the eastern side of it. Let me pull up another screen share of something that I had been looking at. And this is a composite that I pulled together. This is the 12Z NAM, 12Z GFS on the left and 12Z NAM on the right. And this is at 5 o'clock 21Z on Saturday. This is the dew point. map, dew points from the area. And if you look at the way, there's a pivot point here that looks like, as I mentioned before, this warm front is getting pushed up from the south and east, pushed up to the north and west, with a pivot point here being roughly, on both models, actually being roughly the Clarksville, South Boston area in Southern Virginia. And the thing that kind of piqued my interest, it is very reminiscent of a bulge in the dry line out west, which would make it, the area to the north and east of the bulge kind of susceptible to some rotating storms. So that's what kind of piqued my interest, especially, as I mentioned, the I-85, I-95 corridor, and of course in southeastern Virginia. So that, that of course is dependent on whether that wedge front actually does what the models are saying it does. And that's always the tricky part here in this part of the country, is whether that wedge retreats at that time. So with that in mind, what reactions do you guys have to that?
Just kind of looking at some of the other GFS parameters, it does seem to be kind of picking up on that little bulge point there, a little increased bump in energy helicity. CAPE is not super strong there. It's probably upwards of 1,000, which, honestly, here in Virginia, even for given this kind of setup, if this were springtime, we're dealing with this kind of setup, 1,000, 1,500 CAPE could be all you need to get fired off. And in these tropical environments, you don't really necessarily need a ton of CAPE to get your storms going. You just need that crazy atmospheric spin. So having that bulge there in between the superior dew points to the east and I think it was about 50 degrees to the west. It's not your typical sharp dry line like you see on the plains, but it's definitely, for your setup here in the east, I think for all intents and purposes, you could call it a dry line. I don't know if it would have the same power and effect that a Great Plains dry line would have, just because it's not as sharp of a boundary, but it's definitely something to keep an eye on for some kind of, storm scale interaction, giving it that little extra bump it needs to spin up a tornado.
Right.
Yeah, messy environment for sure. And, the differences with the Plains dry line, extend to things like the mid levels. So it'll be interesting to see if that shows up in the observations and what bears out. But no matter what, these have a tendency to be so low based and short lived that it's going to be challenging to, observe one if one forms. And that's what also makes them dangerous to life and property, is that the genesis is often shorter and the lifespan of it being on the ground is shorter. So there's kind of a warning fatigue that can happen in a situation like Texas or Louisiana. North Carolina, not a different situation.
Sure.
Those are kind of the next steps in my mind of how it becomes from a meteorological issue to a communications issue.
Right. And these kind of events, as Andrew mentioned, with that warm wedge front as it retreats, you get these high shear, low CAPE setups, which are fairly, again, it does remind us of springtime, but you can get those quick spin ups, especially along a boundary like a warm front that, as you mentioned, they will spin up very quickly, and sometimes they can go spin up and go away within 1 or 2 radar scans. So it's very difficult to warn against those. Now you spent some time in Oklahoma, right?
Yes.
Yes.
A little over 3 years.
Out there, did you see many high shear, low CAPE setups, or was it usually better out of the situation?
In eastern Oklahoma, you definitely do have high shear, low CAPE too. It's interesting because it's one of the few places in the country where you can expect to get all modes of tornado producing storms in the same year. Perhaps you will definitely have your dry line triggered classic supercells. You have your high shear, low CAPE events in the winter. One of the worst tornadoes to ever hit Tulsa was in December. It was a fascinating case study in 1975. You're also still within that zone where you can get tropical generated tornadoes. Tropical Storm Aaron in 2007 stands out.
Mm-hmm.
And you also get little circulations within MCSs that dive in during the overnight hours,
right,
like what we saw in early August that hit Tulsa. So that's your 4 main ways of doing it. short of a landfalling waterspout. And Tulsa is in a climatological place where all those things can happen. So you really have to be sharp. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that one that just happened recently that was on the front end of that MCS. That was an unusually strong one for a MCS frontline tornado.
Yeah, there was a really good post-mortem, actually a couple of them done on that event. And, you know, that's what you always stay up until 2 in the morning and watch every MCS for. And it very rarely turns out that it happens. And when it did, it was in a very populated, very dense place. So that was very unfortunate.
Right. And I know timing is always important on these, just thinking back to, going way back to Ivan's remnants when it came through in 2004. I was in Northern Virginia at the time, and of course the tornado outbreak that happened there was mainly because the remnants came through almost at the same time of day as Harvey's remnants, or actually this front's lifting through, you know, mid to late afternoon. And so that's why I'm thinking, you know, I know Andrew showed or talked about the 3-kilometer NAM not showing much, but I'm wondering if we can get, you know, even a couple of hours of sunshine would happen to break through in there, especially north of that boundary, kind of destabilize some of that soupy atmosphere as it comes through. That might be something to really keep an eye on.
Do you recall, Chris, with the Ivan setup, was it a wedge setup like this, or was it pretty much, you know, the same atmosphere throughout Virginia as the storm rolled in, or was it? I don't recall it being wedged in, but that was long before my extreme interest in severe weather peaked, and I would have paid attention to that kind of stuff. So I just can't remember what the setup was for that leading into the day's events.
I don't recall, and you know, it was mid-September. It was actually September 17th. So there could have been a wedge, but I don't recall that. I do remember watching radar, and I do remember the atmosphere while we were sitting there watching radar before we headed out was already soupy in our area. So my guess is there weren't any synoptic fronts involved. I think it was just the moisture streaming northward from the remnants.
Gotcha. Yeah, because just looking at, you know, some of the basic things like cloud cover forecast, and it's going to be pretty socked in leading up to this, so that could be a cause for concern in terms of destabilizing the atmosphere enough to really fire up on the GFS. I've switched away, so that could be something that the 3K NAM is picking up on, that it's seeing that, you know, there's going to be a lot of cloud cover that's going to stymie any kind of, you know, good, juicy atmospheric conditions to really get these small cells. Because, you know, one of the things about tropical setups is you don't need big cells to spin up tornadoes. They can be, you know, real small, you know, like, I don't even know if you call them a low top supercell, but, you know, on radar, they don't look like your classic storm. So they may not need as much juice or energy to get going, but, you know, it could be not having enough could stifle it as well in this particular setup with having this wedge in place.
Right. Go ahead, John.
Oh, I pulled up the surface maps from that day in 2004, September 17th, 2004. Actually, yeah, there was no wedge that's really evident. Temperatures peaked in the lower 80s, I think, across much of Piedmont. Center of the low was of Ivan's remnants, you know, was merging with a cold front that stretched to the northeast through West Virginia and Pennsylvania, the trough extending to the south. So it was getting, you know, a change in structure there. I remember that day I was in the Roanoke area, and we had a tornado in Bedford and one near Martinsville, I believe. And there was a tornado warning that got into the Roanoke Valley, which is what made it memorable for me.
You don't get those too often in that area.
No, you don't. And I just pulled this up. This is a screen share of a sounding I pulled up for 21Z on Friday, and this is right at the Clarksville area. And you can see, you know, the profile. You have pretty low LCLs, backing winds, lots of shear, lots of, you know, upper level winds, you know, strong upper level winds out of the southwest and then backing to the southeast at the surface. You know, and again, with this low LCL, that kind of gives you an idea that there's probably not going to be a lot of sunshine. But as you said, Andrew, the idea of low top supercells, which is which is one of the main modes that we see out of these tropical remnants, is these low top supercells coming through and not requiring a whole lot of lift. So yeah, there could be something interesting going on, but as you said, so far the models aren't showing it.
Yeah, and I'm looking at some of the soundings for Southeast Virginia on the GFS for Saturday at 0Z. So if you had the sunshine, it'd be your optimal peak heating, or just after peak heating, and the wind dynamics are there. I mean, you're nice veered wind profile. The photograph's a little messy. Let me share this. Thinking about it. So this is probably in the Chesapeake, Suffolk area. So this is kind of messy just with some of the variations of the wind. But if you just look at it on the side of the SKU-T here, not the strongest surface winds, but bumping up to 50, 60 knots once you get aloft. But so you've got some of that directional shear you need, but doesn't really jump off the page, especially at the low level since it's so weak down there. That may it's only picking up a marginal severe risk here. I'll have to jump back to Friday and see what it's picking up, down into central North Carolina, and see what it's picking up different there versus what it's picking up different in Southeast Virginia on Saturday.
Right. So, overall, right now, and I could show it, but I'm not going to worry about it. The SPC for day 3 for Saturday isn't showing anything other than I think a marginal risk that kind of touches the eastern shore. Depending on how things go, and of course, as we all know, this wedge setup, you almost have to go to the last minute, to get the models and look at the trends and see how they're handling the retreat of the cool air and the advance of the warm moist air. So, my feeling is probably a marginal risk they'll have for day 1, in the I-95, 85 corridor. If it bumped to a slight risk, I'd be slightly surprised, but I think a marginal is probably a good call.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think it's just going to depend on how the setup evolves. The wedge is just such a thorn in the side of trying to forecast severe weather here. I thought I was done with it for the year, and now it's back again with a vengeance. So I think when some of these, the short range some of the better short range models will come into view tomorrow about midday to see what's going to go on Saturday. So I'll be a little more enthused once I see some of those if they start picking up on something versus just looking at the 3K NAM right now. But definitely, down to the Carolinas Friday is definitely something to keep an eye on. That's going to have, I think, the setup that we need in Virginia on Saturday, with getting the juicy environment to fire off some actually decent storms to interact with the shear and with that wedge boundary that's going to be draped across central North Carolina.
Right.
I've looked at the wedge with a little bit of hesitation because you think modeled low 60 afternoon temperatures in late August that's kind of on the extreme end of what's possible around here. I don't think 68 degrees, by the way, is the record minimum high temperature, record coolest high temperature for tomorrow's date here in Richmond. So I don't think that's going to occur because we'll be at 68 before midnight. But, if indeed tomorrow afternoon temperature is, 64, 63, I'm going to have a hard time betting against that to move out overnight and be replaced by 75, 78 degrees.
Right.
With enough time for all the ingredients to come together.
Right.
So we've had way more vigorous low pressure systems come through the Ohio Valley in the springtime that weren't able to scour out a wedge like this. So I don't know what the remains of a tropical system have that a mid latitude cyclone would have to scour out the wedge. So that'll be an interesting play to see how one can perform against the other.
Yeah, the only thing that I would throw into that equation that is an unknown, the biggest unknown right now is, this being August with all that really juicy air still not very far away. We're talking, dew points in the 70s versus maybe the low 60s or upper 50s as we would see in the spring. That might be a factor that doesn't really, play in a springtime wedge setup. So we'll see. But again, the models still don't do a great job, even 48 hours out, of predicting what the wedge is going to do. So we'll have to watch that.
And I suspect that our front's hanging back a couple hours maybe from where we thought. But while I'm looking at the obs, you've got a confirmed tornado warning southwest of Birmingham, so it might be time to stream James Spann once we're done.
Yeah, if you want to see somebody good on a green wall, boy, he'll do it. So
they've done a fantastic job earlier today. They caught a tornado right past. It had to have just been a matter of a few hundred yards away from one of their sky cams.
wow.
They always
Oh,
seem
wow.
to be in the right place at the right time to get one of those on video. So that was very dramatic video that came out of northern Alabama just this afternoon.
Yeah. So I guess we'll know, Andrew, if Zach gets you out on the road on Saturday, we'll know he's excited about it, right?
Yeah. Actually, I was at Busch Gardens yesterday with a workout, and I actually ran into him there briefly. He didn't mention anything about this weekend yet, but I was going to bring up work talk, on a vacation day. So,
Right.
just out of curiosity, I did just pull up 3K NAM sounding for the Peninsula, Newport News, Hampton area on Saturday, 21Z, and it's actually picking up on a tornado hazard. So, I think based on this, I think the SBC outlook area is okay. But if John, like you said, if the eastward movement of the storm starting to hang up a little, I think we could see that, favor west a little bit going in.
I think one or the other is dropping out.
Yeah, I think Andrew dropped out on us.
Okay, so it's not on
Just,
my end. Okay.
No. Well, let me switch gears on us here, John, and I'll put you on the spot a little bit, given the fact that the tropical season is definitely heating up at the moment. What would you see as as we look ahead at Irma's formed and there's a hints of maybe another potential tropical system in the Gulf already. What do you see coming in the next 2-3 weeks?
That's a big question. That's what I've got several times today. I'm sort of taking it one at a time. I can't worry about Jose and Katia when Irma is still full of so many question marks. But the way I don't know if I saw somebody and it stuck in my head or if I thought of it, but it's one of those where everyone is at risk and yet no one is at risk. Everyone is at some slight baseline level, 1 to 5% chance that Irma's eventual track takes it in their corner of the coastline, and yet no one is any actionable specific risk at this moment. So how do you keep people watching without terrifying them? That's the big question for every meteorologist on the Atlantic and Gulf Coast at this point with a storm like Irma. Doesn't really seem like there's much that's going to interfere with it to keep that major hurricane strength over the next several days.
Right.
As far as which models performed better, I don't know that we've had a really good instance so far this year to test that out with a Cape Verde or Cabo Verde hurricane. I think it's going to be the first one that's actually a real test of that situation. Closer into the coastline, we've had tests, but as far as how it performs with the blocking high, we'll see.
Right.
There are disagreements about that right now.
And this seems to be kind of an unusual track for a Cape Verde hurricane, doing this kind of wobble in the ocean. I'm sure it's happened before, but I don't feel like I've seen it happen that often. So that, I know a lot of hurricane forecasters use the Puerto Rico dividing line as, where's it going? And, with it currently right now moving northeast, you're like, all right, it's going way north of Puerto Rico. But, if it shoots down, I know the Hurricane Center up until probably this afternoon was really favoring it, almost hitting the center of the Lesser Antilles. Now I think they're jumping more on board with some of the ensemble models, keeping it much further north and not getting nearly as far south or as close to the Antilles. I'm just looking at the 18Z GFS ensemble. The mean is still off the coast, but it's a mean looking model too, with pressure hitting below 920 or getting into the major hurricane status pressure range, sitting kind of north of Puerto Rico and east of Miami if you were to draw a line from the two. So it still doesn't have a landfall. It has a few spaghetti straps that one goes to Jacksonville, Florida. One actually somehow miraculously goes straight up to Chesapeake Bay, which if that were to ever happen would be catastrophic if it did what that's showing. But it's one of 100 models it's spitting out at you. So take it for a
Right.
grain of salt at this point.
Yeah, if you want or don't want Irma to go in the direction of any particular place, you can find an ensemble member to show you that right now.
Exactly.
Every single thing is on the table, and you know, the thought was there and it's gone. But you know, strength has things to do with it. Land interaction, maybe in the Caribbean, if that's the route that it takes, is going to have something to do with it. So, you know, it's just so premature to have a gut feeling. It's interesting too when you talk about climatology of where it is and what its destiny is and how that southwest motion is a little unusual. I wish I could credit who put the thought out there on Twitter, but one hurricane expert I follow noted that of the storms that far east in the main development region that had that southwesterly track that we're expecting, west southwest, it was in a league of hurricanes that we have all heard of that either impacted land somewhere in the East Coast or the Caribbean. On the other hand, the league of hurricanes that have done what Irma has done and done that explosive strengthening so far east, those are all hurricanes that nobody on land, no average person would have ever heard of because they all curved out to sea. So you have one bit of behavior saying, you know, this is in a status of storms that's caused trouble before. And another bit of trivia that says all the other things that have acted like this ended up recurring. So history, you know, can
So not only can you find a model to go whichever way you want, you can find some kind of historical reference that'll also satisfy
which makes
your
it
hunger for a result.
Which also makes it, as you pointed out, John, very difficult to not only communicate the actual risk, but to keep people's attention, because you don't want to feel like you're crying wolf, but you don't want them to ignore it either.
Indeed. So we got to be careful not to do cherry picking, but I'm actually a little bit encouraged. I think we've gone through so many hurricane seasons now on social media where there's that one extreme outcome that takes off that people latch onto that doesn't turn out to be the case. I think people, I think in the general population are getting wise to that if it's still 1 or 2 weeks away, you know, not to panic necessarily. I don't sense that there's panic about Irma even after Harvey.
Yeah.
You have to take and judge each storm on its own merits, but they're inevitable comparisons. Once you have a bad Harvey, you worry that the next one is going to be as bad or worse, and you just have to evaluate each one on its own.
And you do have that, I guess, I don't know what the official term is, but it's storm fatigue or a heightened sense of being scared. You know, the whole thing, like in 2013 there in Oklahoma, you know, after the Moore tornado, and then 10 to 11 days later you had the Reno tornado where people were panicking because they had just been through something like that. So yeah, that's something to keep in mind. But yeah, you're right. This is way too far out for anybody to be pointing out that it's going to be in your backyard next weekend kind of thing.
Yeah, you can't be planning your evacuation just now, because it could very easily miss you by 1,000 miles and you're fine. So you just kind of got to let everything work itself out. It's still 5 days at least from being even close to land at this point, even an island in the Caribbean. So no sense getting worked up at this point.
Yeah, and for people that live within 50 miles of the coast that maybe haven't had to think yet so far this year about what would I do, and are now confronted with the thought, there are actions you can take that would make you sleep better at night that don't take very long. Next time you're at the grocery store, maybe get that case of water, because you should have had it anyways at June 1st, the beginning of hurricane season, or that pack of batteries. It doesn't mean panic buying or hoarding, but if that's the nudge it takes to make sure you have that disaster box filled up, then tomorrow, day after, why not? If Irma's not the storm, maybe it's one in October, maybe it's one in 2018. It just doesn't hurt to take a little bit of action, a little bit of smart action. That's what I would say.
Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. Well, we've rambled on for about 35 minutes here. Do we want to have any closing comments? What do you think, Andrew?
I think just like every setup I feel like we had this spring, because of this pesky wedge, it's gonna be kind of a wait and see environment just to see what's able to overcome the wedge, if the wedge is going to break down at all. I think just watching its progression tomorrow to see how much it breaks down will be a good indication of what to expect Saturday. If it breaks down really fast tomorrow, then not only will it eventually be closer to Virginia by Saturday morning, but we'll know how much it's going to retreat during the day potentially. So not used to dealing with this kind of a weather setup with the wedge this time of year. So it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. And if it plays out, I'll try to be out there, probably looking in southeast Virginia, at least for now. But if things can slow up and move themselves west a little bit and open up a little more Virginia to the potential for severe weather, then chasing wise, that would be more ideal for me. But I know that wouldn't be more ideal for people having to deal with it. So.
Right. John, what do you think? Any closing comments?
Closing thoughts. It's interesting. This is a new one. You've got competing factors, and it's a little bit cliche, but by this time tomorrow, I think we'll know a whole lot more. And if anywhere needs to be concerned about severe weather, Friday night or Saturday, it would be far southeastern Virginia. Right.
Yeah, I'm kind of waiting for, as we've said, some of the newer model runs. I'm curious to see what the 0Z tonight 0Z WRF runs are going to show, because they've been relatively accurate. If you kind of look at several of the WRF runs and get several of the WRF models and get an idea what they're saying, they've been kind of decently on this year. Of course, none of them are really good when it comes to the wedge, but we'll take a look at that. So, and if I do chase, if the setup we've been talking about comes to fruition and it does move a little bit further west of the 95 corridor, I would probably target maybe Clarksville on Saturday afternoon. But that's a haul for me, so it's got to be a pretty decent setup, pretty promising, at least for me to make it that far out. So it's not really crucial, but it's kind of interesting to look at. So. Alrighty, with that, we will bid everybody good evening, and we'll come back together sometime if there's another setup this fall, or maybe we'll talk about some more this winter. Good talking to everybody.
All right, good night.
Y'all have a good one.